I'd like to switch gears now and talk a little bit about DNS of a different application, and that is reheat combustion relevant to load and fuel flexible gas turbines for electricity production. So in this set of DNS that was performed by Aditya Kanduri, my previous postdoc who's moved on to Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore as a professor, he simulated DNS using a multi-block code built on top of S3D. So instead of having a single block with the uniform mesh, you can construct using something that looks like Lego blocks, a little bit of complexity in the geometry by arranging the blocks. And this is work that we did in collaboration with Andrea Gruber at SINTEF in Norway and Mirko Bothian from the Ansaldo Energia, who is responsible for developing the GT36 gas turbine. So I had presented this slide yesterday at the beginning of the lectures to describe this axially staged combustor, which has a first stage, which is premixed, lean premixed, that's largely stabilized by flame propagation, and then followed with the sequential second combustion stage that takes the vitiated products coming out of the first stage, and then you inject additional fuel and mix it, and mixed with the vitiated gases, creates conditions for autoignition being the predominant mode of combustion in the reheat combustor, secondary reheat combustor. So the DNS configuration here is shown. And it basically is operating at high inlet temperatures of about 1100 Kelvin. And the real combustor is operating at 20 atmospheres. But we thought we would initially start by looking at a 1 atmosphere simplified case to look at vitiated mixtures in this mixing tube, followed by sudden expansion into a combustion chamber. So it's a duct and a duct kind of configuration. And we have combustion and the flame autoignition generated and stabilized then in the combustor. And so we have a turbulent inflow condition generated from a separate incompressible channel flow. And then we have this rectangular duct whose length is prescribed by the ignition length that depends on the ignition delay time of the fuel mixture that you inject upstream. And the fuel that we considered here initially is hydrogen, although later we are going to also look at blends of hydrogen and natural gas. And the objective is to understand how this reheat combustion is stabilized and identify the modes of combustion. Again, this is one of these examples where you have multiple modes, including autoignition, premixed flame propagation, and heat losses, for example, to the wall. And then also look at the role of the shear zone and the interaction of this recirculation zone that exists due to this sudden expansion that helps to anchor the combustion in the combustor downstream. And then we want to quantify the roles of flame propagation and autoignition in this environment, as before when I was talking about the compression ignition engines. So this is a calculation that had 4 blocks, 1, 2, 3, 4. One is block 1 is the mixing tube, mixing duct, and 2, 3, and 4 represent the combustor. It took about 1.25 billion grid cells, 20 million CPU hours on a NERSC machine, Cori at LBL, and the bulk Reynolds number here was 13,000. Chemical mechanisms, a mechanism that we used is based on Lee Dreyer et al. With the detailed model with 9 species representing hydrogen air combustion. The inflow here was comprised of hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, plus water, representing some of the vitiated gases. Of a previous, the first stage combustor was burning at a lean fuel equivalence ratio of 0.35. This is a pretty high bulk velocity of 200 meters a second, and the RMS velocity was about 10% of the bulk velocity. Inlet temperature, again, was 1100 Kelvin, so this is high enough for ignition to occur for hydrogen-oxygen systems at these conditions. And then the wall was maintained at colder 750 Kelvin conditions that are representative of the gas turbine. As I said, we had a turbulent, we first generated feed data for the DNS from a fully developed channel flow calculation at a bulk Reynolds number of 13,000, a viscous Reynolds of 378. And then we had a sampling plane that we used for the turbulent inflow to the reacting simulation. This is what the stationary configuration looks like after several flow-through times. And what I'm plotting here is the entropy conditioned on temperature. And in the middle, this big red blob, this triangular blob, corresponds to the heat release rate, which shows combustion happening beyond the sudden expansion of the mixing tube. And so you see the colder temperatures given by the bluish cyan colors, and then the higher temperatures where reactions are occurring in the yellowish orange colors. And what I'll describe are two different combustion modes that we saw. We were hoping to only see the design state, which is mainly autoignition happening in the combustion chamber downstream of the mixing tube. But we also saw some intermittent autoignition happening in the mixing section upstream sporadically. And so I'll describe what we see. So let's first talk about the design combustion state. In this state, I'm plotting here the picture of heat release rate, isocontours in the top, the temperature in the middle, and the mass fraction of hydrogen peroxy, hydroperoxy radical, HO2, in the bottom plot here. And so what's clear from these images is a more volumetric heat release, broader regions in the center of this combustion chamber representing kind of autoignition along the center line. And then as you get closer to the corners, you start to see thinner reaction heat release layers representative of maybe flame propagation or deflagration near the corners that are anchored on the hot products that are recirculating behind that sudden expansion. And then there's a shear layer that develops in between there. You can see that the shear zone is causing lots and lots of mixing of the temperature that brings colder boundary layer temperatures close to 750 Kelvin mixing with the hotter ignition products closer to the center line. And other evidence of autoignition, clear chemical evidence, is the presence of this big blob of HO2 radical along the center line, which is autoigniting kind of accumulating volumetrically, whereas along the corners you see these thin filaments of HO2 that you might see in a premixed hydrogen air flame. To get a clearer picture of exactly which mode of combustion is happening along the center line and near the corners, we took two slices, a cut A along the center and a cut B closer to the corners. And we looked at the budget once again of the OH radical and looked at the balance between advection, diffusion, and reaction. And we know it's going to be autoignition if advection balances reaction, the net reaction rate of OH production. And we know flame propagation will be dominant if there's a balance between molecular diffusion and reaction. And so in cut A along the center of this combustor, what we found is that reaction, is denoted by the red line, is counterbalanced by advection, where diffusion is this green line close to 0. Also plotted here is the progress variable, C, that increases across that reaction front from 0 to 1. Contrary to what happens along the center line, if you look at the corners, you see a change in that balance. You see a balance largely between reaction, consumption of OH, production, followed by production, spatially downstream, and that's counterbalanced by diffusion. And advection is not important in this case. So we're convinced then that near the corners, where it's colder and less likely to autoignite, there's the existence of this, the fuel that comes from the boundary layer that's advected in there is largely anchored by premixed combustion. Now I'd like to talk about the other off-design state where we see intermittent autoignition happening in upstream of the combustor, which is not desirable. We see early autoignition sometimes in this mixing section where the ignition kernels appear and then they're advected downstream, and it occurs kind of sporadically. And that's shown here by the heat release rate plot, isocontours, the temperature, as well as the presence of HO2, this HO2 island that spans both across the entire channel of the mixing tube upstream of the combustion section. And before I talk more about this intermittent combustion state, I want to just corroborate what we found from the OH budget by doing a separate chemical explosive mode analysis to determine the balance of autoignition and flame propagation assisted by ignition. And so Tianfeng Liu and his students have developed this augmented chemical explosive mode analysis, which looks at the ratio of the projected non-chemical source terms, these are the diffusion terms, and the projected chemical source term projected into the direction of the most explosive mode. So this is the alignment of diffusion and reaction along in the direction of the explosive mode. And from this ratio, when alpha, when it's larger than unity, that is indicative of assisted flame propagation being the main, being predominant. On the other hand, when alpha is less than unity, then diffusion is less important, then you'd expect autoignition to be a predominant role, where chemistry is the important factor. And lastly, when alpha is less than minus unity, then we find that diffusion dominates chemistry and suppresses ignition, and there's a propensity for local extinction to occur. And so color-coded, according to these three different modes, we took all the data points in the volume of the domain and looked at this balance. And so the green regions here are indicative of autoignition occurring, whereas the red isocontour regions show the existence of flame propagation assisted by ignition, and blue along the cold boundary layers are regions that could be likely to be subjected to heat losses and quenching. If we further condition the percentage of the fuel consumption rate or the heat release rate, but these are different for hydrogen, but for fuel consumption rate, condition on this alpha, this chemical mode, explosive mode regime identification metric, what we find is that over 80% of the fuel that's consumed in this combustion chamber is due to autoignition, with the balance being, a little bit of the flames near the corners being assisted, flame propagation assisted by ignition. So now let me go back to the problem with the intermittent ignition state, autoignition state. So once again, this is the heat release contours for autoignition, and we see these little sporadic heat release rate appearing upstream of where it's supposed to appear in the mixing chamber. And if we plot the dilatation locally there, we find that there is a well, first I should say, when you have a big body of autoignition happening in the combustion chamber, it gives rise to pressure, increase in the pressure that generates pressure waves that propagate both upstream and downstream of that ignition, that triangular ignition region in the chamber, combustion chamber. And the waves that propagate downstream are fine. They leave the domain or the combustion chamber. The ones that propagate upstream could be problematic if they go into the mixing tube, because you have this, this development of this constructive interference pattern sometimes from the longitudinal and the transverse pressure waves that coalesce in the middle of the channel. And this is just isentropic compression, right? And that leads to a small increase in the temperature by about 20 to 30 degrees Kelvin, which you might think, well, that's not a lot compared to, to do much with anything. And maybe it's not for natural gas, but because we're considering the fuel hydrogen, which is highly reactive and autoignitive, it does matter, and it decreases the ignition delay time for these conditions by 30%. And that's enough that when we had designed that mixing tube length to correspond with the homogeneous ignition delay, that's not enough to factor in these increases in temperature. And so we do see ignition occurring at shorter times and upstream of the combustion chamber. So it's due to this, a result of the pressure work that's generated from the autoignition that's happening in the combustion chamber that interacts with the walls and the sound waves to coalesce and form these sporadic temperature increases, giving rise to autoignition. So to conclude this section, we've performed DNS of a reheat burner at scaled conditions. 2 states were observed. The design state, which is designed to have primarily autoignition occurring with a little bit of flame propagation anchored near the corners. And we do see this second off-design state in the mixing section due to autoignition, due to pressure and a small temperature rise. And we quantified the different modes that are occurring in the combustion chamber towards the heat release using this new chemical explosive mode analysis. And in the future, we plan to take this into understanding better this unstable flame behavior and conditions that lead to it. And then we're also performing calculations to change both the fuel composition, different blends of hydrogen with natural gas, and with different non-uniform or stratification of these mixtures, and at different inlet temperatures beyond just 1100 Kelvin. We hope with AMR that we can take this up to higher pressures, moving closer towards realistic pressures on the order of 20 atmospheres. So let me stop this section, and I'll go into, how are we doing for time? We've got 4:15. Okay. You guys have any questions on this part? No? It's getting late in the afternoon.
What's the order of the special dispensation in Violi?
The order?
Yeah.
It's 8th order. 8th order centered finite difference.
Is it the same stencils you have in S3D?
It is. It's S3D, exactly S3D, but multiple blocks, so they have interior boundary conditions between the blocks. And right now we're requiring them the mesh to line up between the blocks.
So it's better than AR, so I could, if I have my own solver with some stencils, can I bring a Peli to handle the AMR, or just put Peli built around S3D?
No, Peli, while S3D is a finite difference code, the Peli suite of codes are finite volume, and they have their own stencils. They're 2nd and 4th order accurate stencils. And so it's all, you could just use what they have. Yep. Okay. I have one last physics example to present, and then to talk about, and then I want to touch upon some of the machine learning concepts. So this last example has to do with turbulent premixed flames under very intense turbulence conditions that are relevant to lean premixed combustion in gas turbines to prevent NOx while still keeping high efficiencies. And this is work that was done in collaboration with Howie Wong. At that time, he was a postdoc with Evett Hawks, and now he's a professor at Zhejiang University. And Bruno Savard, Evett, and myself. And so this is the first DNS where we actually looked at directly comparing the DNS with an experiment. And we were fortunate because under intense turbulence conditions, to get these spatially developing jets to actually be feasible in DNS, they have to have very fast flow-through times, which is helped by having fast, intense turbulent velocities. And so you want to have a shorter, smaller computational domain size. And again, this is motivated by lean premixed gas turbine combustion with low NOx, no particulates, and there are still issues with lean premixed combustion associated with instability, thermoacoustics, lean blow-off, where the entire flame extinguishes, flashback near walls. So if a flame propagates or creeps up near the boundary layers, that can create all kinds of problems, and autoignition. And so the case that we looked at was a stratified lean methane air premixed flame at very intense conditions, in turbulence conditions, or so-called high Karlovitz conditions, where the turbulence is Reynolds numbers are relatively high, and there's strong overlap between the turbulence timescales and flame timescales. So here, in these conditions, designers are trying to extend the lean flammability limit. So they want to burn right at the edge where there's these very strong interactions between chemistry and turbulence. And there's questions about whether there's stratification effects that occur between the anchoring mechanisms. A lot of these lean premixed flames require bluff body stabilization, cavity stabilization, or pilot stabilization, otherwise they would blow out. And so there's a question about what the influence of the pilot or the stabilization mechanism is on the overall structure and burning rate, because it's not just an isolated premixed flame. And then there's questions of whether we can apply flamelet-like modeling techniques that have worked in lower intensity turbulence conditions to these more intense turbulent conditions. And so this is the burner that we're trying to simulate. This is developed at Lund University in Marcus Aldine's group, and Bo Zhao was the experimentalist. And so this is I think it might be luminosity of this piloted premixed jet flame. So it has lots of mean shear, and it's surrounded by this very large, this flame is pretty small, thin and small. The diameter of the tube is only 1 or 1.5 millimeters, but it's surrounded by this very wide pilot flame, which prevents entrainment of ambient air in the room, in the laboratory, to affect or quench the flame. And so in premixed combustion, there's this regime diagram that was developed a long time ago that describes the different regimes for turbulent premixed flames. And it plots the intensity of the turbulence relative to the laminar burning velocity on the ordinate versus the ratio of length scales between the turbulence integral length scales and the laminar flame thicknesses, laminar flame scales. And so this regime diagram, developed by Borghi and then later looked at by Foreman Williams and others, shows various regimes where you have, that I'll talk about in a minute. And the experiments that were performed at Lund were performed in this so-called between the thin reaction zone regime and a more intense turbulence distributed reaction zone regime. And they performed a number of test cases that span these two regimes. So the objectives here were to perform the first DNS of a stratified high Karlovitz premix flame. And then we wanted to compare the turbulent flame structure at different axial positions in the jet with the corresponding 1D strained laminar flame structure to see whether flamelets would be applicable in this regime. We also wanted to quantify the stratification between the premix jet and its pilot. The premix jet was at an equivalence ratio of 0.4, whereas the pilot was at an equivalence ratio of 0.9. And so there's this back-supported pilot that's providing enthalpy and heat, or enthalpy and radicals to the jet flame. And then we wanted to further identify the flow of carbon and the chemical pathways in this high Karlovitz flame and whether it changes as you evolve downstream. So just to briefly touch upon the different scales in turbulent premix combustion, there are integral scales. These are the largest eddies that are dictated by the combustor geometry, and these transfer energy through the cascade, through the inertial range, on down into the dissipation range where energy is dissipated. And then the smallest scales are given by the turbulent Kolmogorov scales, which scale with the kinematic viscosity and the dissipation rate to this 1/4 power. And then the turbulence time scale, of course, scales with the ratio of the turbulent integral scale to the turbulent RMS velocity. It's actually equal to that. And then the flame thickness and time and the reaction zone thickness are provided here, where the laminar flame thickness is equal to the diffusivity, the ratio of the diffusivity to the laminar burning velocity. And the flame time is given by the ratio of the flame thickness to its laminar burning velocity. And generally, the premix flame, which varies between the unburnt and burnt temperatures, has a thermal thickness across the entire the temperature jump, but it also has a thin inner layer, L delta, that has thickness that's much smaller than the overall thickness of the entire flame. So roughly about a 10th or 20th of that, 10th of that thickness. Some of the dimensionless quantities that are used in premix turbulent combustion include the turbulent Reynolds number, which is based on the RMS velocity and the integral scale, and the Schmidt number of this is of the order of unity for most of the gases that we consider. The turbulent Domkohler number is a measure of the ratio of the large scale, integral scale, turbulence timescales to the laminar flame timescales. And the Karlovitz number then measures the interaction of the small scale turbulence, flame time, the ratio of the flame time to the Kolmogorov time scale. So Domkohler's measure of the interaction of the large scales with respect to the flame time, and Karlovitz is a measure of the small scale interaction between the turbulence and the flame. And from asymptotics, the general structure that's found in a turbulent premix flame is given in this diagram here that shows this preheat zone where heat from the flame is being transported into and preheating the reactants, the fuel and the oxidizer. And then you have a much thinner inner layer where fuel is being consumed and radicals are helping to oxidize the fuel. And then behind that, you have a broader oxidation layer where the fuel is converted into hydrogen, H2, and CO, and those are oxidized to water and CO2 to the final products. The oxidation layer is also a region on the backside of the flame where radicals are produced and diffused back into the inner layer to help attack and oxidize the fuel. So I just, these are in your notes, but briefly, you can think of the regime diagram as in the corrugated flamelet regime where the turbulence intensity is on the order of the laminar burning velocity. So this is weaker turbulence, and the flames are generally much thinner than the smallest turbulence scales, the Kolmogorov scales. And so this is why you need AMR, because even if you resolve all the way down to the finest turbulence scales, the flames are typically 10 times an order of magnitude even thinner. And then as we move up into the distributed or so-called broken reaction zones regime, the Karlovitz number based on the inner layers of the order of unity, Karlovitz number based on the overall flame thickness is greater than 100, above about 100. So this is regimes where you have intense small-scale mixing, maybe disrupting or interacting with the flame's reaction layers. And in this situation, the inner layer is smaller than the laminar flame thickness, but still larger than the Kolmogorov thickness. And then lastly, in between the corrugated flamelet and the broken reaction zones is this regime that Norbert Peters had found called the thin reaction zones regime. And in this regime, which resides between Karlovitz number of 1 unity and Karlovitz number of about 100, the notion is that small-scale Kolmogorov eddies are able to penetrate and stir up the preheat layer while it's not sufficient to penetrate or disrupt the reaction layer. So we chose to do DNS in the so-called distributed or broken reaction zones regime where the Karlovitz number is larger than 100. And to compare the amount of flame wrinkling, or the so-called flame surface density, amount of area that's generated per unit volume from this turbulent flame in an average sense, this is a RANS image of the flame surface density. We've compared the DNS here on the left with the experiment on the right, and you get roughly the same flame height and roughly the same flame, roughly the same height and width of the flame surface density. A more quantitative metric was to compare the integral of the flame surface density in the radial direction of the jet between the experiment and the DNS, and we get very good agreement throughout the development of the jet. The experiment is shown in the red line, and the DNS is in the green line. And to show that we're in the broken reaction zones regime, we plotted the evolution downstream in our turbulent methane air jet flame, going from the upstream in blue to downstream in green and orange in the jet. And we find that the trajectory of our flame, as represented by a progress variable isosurface of 0.9, stays largely above 100 throughout the entire height of the jet. So I think we're in the distributed or broken reaction zones regime. This right figure shows the Karlovitz number that's computed at different progress variable isocontours representing the preheat zone at a value of about 0.1, the progress variable 0.9, which would be on the product side of the flame, and the 0.1 is represented by the dotted line, whereas the 0.9 is progress variable is represented by the dashed line. And in all cases, the Karlovitz number is extremely high. It's well over 1,000 upstream, far upstream, until you get to a jet diameter of about 20 or 30, where you get significant reduction down to closer to several hundred. So these are very intensely mixed and flames that are subjected to lots of turbulence. This is a configuration diagram of the DNS, which shows the mixture that is injected. It's at 300 Kelvin, has a bulk gas velocity of 165 meters a second. The jet diameter is the same as in the experiment, 1.5 millimeters. And the fuel-air equivalence ratio here was 0.4, so it's extraordinarily lean, close to the lean limit. The reduced mechanism here that we used is based on the GRMEC 3.0, including the NO chemistry. And we're using a reduced model developed by Liu and Law with 28 species and 268 elementary reactions. The pilot flame surrounding the jet had a temperature of 1800 Kelvin, a much slower velocity of a little under 2 meters a second, and it generates products of combustion from a methane air flame burning at an equivalence ratio of 0.9. So you can see there's a lot of stratification between the primary jet flame at 0.4 and the pilot at 0.9. The inlet mean velocity profile is prescribed using a power law velocity for an axisymmetric, fully developed turbulent pipe flow. And on top of that, we superimposed inlet turbulence, isotropic turbulence, that of a value of about 4% of the bulk velocity based on the Passot-Pouquet turbulence energy spectrum. And that was enough to trigger then the Kelvin-Helmholtz instability and then the shear-driven turbulence that develops in the domain. The calculation, I should say the domain size was such that we had about 48 diameters in the axial direction, 36 in the other two directions. And the mesh spacing that was required to resolve the Kolmogorov and flame thicknesses was of the order of 20 microns. And then we were able to simulate about 3 flow-through times, 1 flow-through time initially, and then to let transients go out of the domain, and then collect statistics over 2 flow-through times. And this was performed on Titan with, again, large allocations and computing time on large core counts, upwards of 200,000 on Titan, so over half of the machine, for about a little less than a week. So let me play a movie again to show you the development of this turbulent premixed flame. Stationary flame with OH on the left, and then the entropy, or representing the turbulence, on the right. And so what we've done in this visualization is to take a cutting plane right through the center of the jet, so you can see what the structure looks like. And I'll rotate this. So that's OH. And this is entropy. Yeah.
Can you explain what entropy is?
It's the square of the vorticity, magnitude of the square of the vorticity. So it's a measure of the rotational motion in the turbulence. And so you end up with these very long worm-like structures, like these thin filamentary kinds of structures. So if we look at just the slice through the center of the jet, we can look at all the different temperature and species concentrations. And there's a couple of things to note. So temperature is the leftmost frame. Heat release rate is the second frame. The fuel, methane, is the third frame. And then some of the intermediates that are part of the oxidation process of methane, including methyl radical, formaldehyde, and CO, follow here. And then you have CO and H2, which are part of the oxidation zone of the premix flame, are shown here. And then what do I have here? Is this H? Yeah, H atom, which is one of the key radicals for chain branching and produced in the oxidation layer and then diffused into the inner reaction layer to attack the fuel. To consume the fuel is shown here. OH radical, which is present at the flame, and then it recombines slowly, so it's present and long-lived out in the product side of the flame. And HO2, which is present at lower temperatures closer towards the preheat zone. And so we have a full characterization of this turbulent jet flame from the DNS. Yep. At the bottom? Because of the pilot. So that bigger round circle at the bottom is due to the surrounding pilot that's at a 0.9 equivalence ratio. That helps to anchor this flame, because without that pilot, and you have this turbulence blowing at this flame, it would blow it out. So I want to call your attention to the near field. So a few diameters downstream of the jet, you might notice that heat release rate has almost vanished. So it's almost like the turbulence is so intense that you've extinguished the flame. But it's really still present, but very, very faint. And if I'd plotted on a log scale, maybe you would see it better. That's also true of CO. There's hardly any CO, and H2 and H atom are kind of absent in the near field, or at very low concentrations. And we'll talk about that in a minute, and what happens when you have very, very strong strain rates and turbulence-induced stretch due to strain as well as curvature stretch. So when a flame's really wrinkled, its own self-propagation can create stretch that helps that the flame is subjected to. So by contrast, when we move downstream in the jet, it seems like the first thing you see is that the center, the preheat zone on either side of this jet is no longer at its original condition of 300 Kelvin, but it's preheated as you move downstream to higher temperatures, probably due to turbulent diffusion and possibly flame-flame interaction across the two sides of the jet. And so the preheat zone that is your upstream reactants is now at a different temperature. The other thing to note is that we see a lot of intermediate species accumulate or be produced downstream in the jet at about 20 to 30 diameters. We see formaldehyde there, and we see lots of H2 and also HO2, which starts to develop as the temperatures go up. They're either developed or they got transported, because HO2 is kind of long-lived, as is formaldehyde. So it's quite interesting that there's very little heat release upstream, and that it's burning much more robustly as you move downstream. So I mentioned that this was a stratified flame in the sense that the pilot is providing back support to this very lean flame. And so what you see in this plot is the mean heat release rate, these isocontours, conditioned on the equivalence ratio and on the downstream distance in the jet, where the origin of the jet here is on the left, and far downstream at 40 or 50 diameters is on the right. And so you can see this progression to burning towards leaner and leaner mixtures where the heat release is maximum due to stratification. So stratification and back support of the mixture fraction gradient provides heat and radicals that make the flame burn more intensely, and it and the flames end up being thinner. And so it's often neglected in these piloted flames or bluff body stabilized flames what these product gases actually do. We can look at some of the burning velocity, turbulent burning velocity statistics. And in premixed combustion, often that's given, the turbulent ratio of the turbulent burning velocity relative to the laminar burning velocity is given by the amount of wrinkling of the flame, which is represented by the ratio of the turbulent area for burning, or surface density, compared with the laminar area. And then it's multiplied by this I naught factor, which is an integral of the fuel consumption rate over the volume. And you can think of the fuel consumption rate along the normal to the wrinkled flame surface being evaluated and compared with its laminar value, reference value. And so what I've shown here is just different, the turbulent burning velocity evolution downstream, which starts out from the laminar burning velocity and it increases. And the increase is largely due to the generation of area. I should say this is the turbulent burning velocity is given by the blue line, and the area increase is given by the green line. But what we also notice under these intense turbulence conditions is that the fuel consumption is much less than unity, where it would be if it was equal to the laminar burning velocity, the laminar fuel consumption. And this is due to straining effects, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And the different, we evaluated the surface density based on different definitions for species, O2, CO2, methane, and water. But in general, you get about a several-fold increase in the turbulent burning velocity primarily due to area surface density increase from the wrinkling of the flame, whereas the consumption rate, actually, especially in the upstream area, is actually decreased. So we can also look at the conditional mean heat release and evaluate whether a laminar strained flamelet might be able to approximate the turbulent flame at different axial positions downstream from 8 on to 32. And so what's plotted here in these conditional heat release plots, conditioned on temperature, are the scatter plots and the conditional means from the DNS shown in the red line, and then 2 additional curves corresponding to the flamelet solution for unity Lewis number, where all of the species are assumed to have equal diffusivities. That would be the case with the black line, and where we have modeled the different diffusivities and different Lewis numbers for each of the species with the green line. And so overall, we can see very good agreement at different downstream positions between the conditional means of the turbulent flame and those of the flamelets. And especially the agreement is better when you assume that you have a unity Lewis number between flame description with the flamelets. Now, to make the comparison, to select how to define the flamelets was a little bit, we had to take some considerations into account. So because the flame evolves so much between the near field and the far field, we decided that it would be best to take local conditions at a given axial position of the mean strain rate at that position and its mean upstream composition and temperature to add to a laminar counterflow configuration. This is a strained 1D laminar flame that kind of represents the processes that are going on inside of this turbulent flame. So rather than taking the upstream conditions for the reactants and products, we take it locally at different downstream positions. And so if we do that, we get these really nice curves that agree between the DNS and the strained laminar flames. And it's also important to look at reactants counterflowing against product gases rather than twin flames where you have reactants coming in from both sides of an opposed jet burner. Because in that case, you end up having the backside of the flame, the products, interacting first before you have, whereas in the upstream you have very little product interaction between the two flames. So it's better to use our reactants against products. Just to give you a little more detail on the comparison between the turbulent conditional means, again shown in the red line for CO and hydrogen at different axial positions upstream in the top row and downstream in the bottom row, against the two flamelet solutions. Green is unity Lewis number, black is non-unity Lewis number. And so in both cases, we find the unity Lewis number does a better job at approximating the conditional species statistics. And this is because I think that under these large turbulence intensities, you have the turbulent diffusion is overwhelming any differences in molecular diffusion. This would not necessarily be true as you go to less intense turbulence regimes like the flamelet regime, for example. And here's some other species that are kind of interesting and important in the flame to look at comparisons. This is the H atom. So again, you get pretty good agreement. There are a few discrepancies between the DNS solution in red and the flamelets, which kind of underpredict H atom as you go downstream. And I think there's some issues with the accumulation of radicals that I'll talk about in a minute that might lead to some of the discrepancies between the laminar flamelet solution and the turbulent DNS solution. So to get a better idea of what's actually going on as we evolve from the near field to downstream, we integrated the species reaction rates, that is the net reaction rate between consumption minus, or production minus consumption, and we averaged them across the radial and azimuthal directions, and we took a very, very thin pancake slice at each at different axial positions to get enough data to do the to compute the integral. And so generally what we find is that in the near field, up to about 20 to 30 diameters, there's a net production of radicals in the near field. And these radicals aren't consumed, but rather a lot of them are convected downstream or turbulently diffused, and they tend to accumulate downstream. And then downstream of about 25, 30 diameters, for example, methyl radical and formaldehyde are completely oxidized. So they're consumed. Oh, where's my arrow? Lost it. Well, anyway, methyl's consumed downstream of about 25, and so is formaldehyde, and it's completely consumed by the end of the domain. Whereas other radicals like CO, OH, and H are partially consumed by when they're transported downstream. So if we look at the carbon flow diagram, again, in the near field and in the far field, and we compare it with the laminar flame solutions, we find that in the near field, there's this progression from methane, which is oxidized by radicals OH and O to form methyl radical, and then down the C1 chain, we get radicals like CH2O, formaldehyde, and then formal radical, and then eventually CO and CO2. And the percentages of the carbon flow roughly are approximated pretty well by the laminar flame laminar flames, with the exception of CO. When we go, and interesting, whoops, interesting, we see that when we compare downstream with upstream, we see lots more of the carbon flow through this C1 oxidation pathway than we do upstream. And in particular, we see CO oxidation being extremely high, 87%, for example, as depicted by the width of the arrows, downstream compared to about 5% of CO that's being oxidized upstream. And there seems to be a very large discrepancy between the laminar flame oxidation of CO downstream and the turbulent percentages. So we looked a bit closer at what was happening, and what we found is that when we conditioned the heat release rate at different axial locations, conditioned on elementary reactions that contribute to the heat release rate, what we found was that most of the reactions, why does my arrow keep, come on, oh, it's not going to work, that contribute to heat release are through this C1 pathway oxidation of the methane. Reactions involving O atom and methyl radical generate lots of heat. This is the red and the green curves, and as does the oxidation of methane with OH. So the red, green, and blue curves in the top figure generate most of the heat release in the upstream regions. There's also some contribution from an endothermic reaction from hydrogen plus H plus O2 forming the chain branching reaction, forming O plus OH. But what happens when you go downstream of about 25 or 30 is that the mechanism for heat release generation shifts because we've accumulated all this unreacted production of radicals and transported it downstream, the formaldehyde, HO2, and some of these other species. And now, because you have larger numbers of radicals and crucial species like hydrogen that are responsible for producing radicals, heat release is largely accomplished through CO oxidation with OH. R94, reaction 94 is important downstream, as is H2 plus OH going to water plus H. And the reactions with HO2 are also very exothermic, reactions 82 and reactions 31. So there's this change in the mechanisms, chemical mechanisms generating heat release as we move downstream, and the result of the reason for this is because of the accumulation of radicals that are not able to be consumed due to the high strain rates, high turbulence conditions upstream, that then when the turbulence relaxes as it goes downstream, the reactions are able to complete and consume the radicals, and some of these mechanisms for how heat is produced shifts as you move downstream, favoring CO plus OH, the water gas shift reaction. So to summarize this section, we did perform the first stratified premixed jet flame at large Karlovitz numbers above 1,000. We found that the flame structure is heavily influenced by the intense turbulence, and that a strained reactions to products counterflow configuration with a unity Lewis number at the local reactant composition temperature conditions is able to capture the mean flame structure. And hence, and especially with unity Lewis number, we believe that's because of the large turbulence diffusivity that's dominant over molecular diffusion. The flame here was found to be back supported and the flame propagates towards leaner mixtures downstream. And the net production of radicals in the near field are convected downstream and build up and are finally oxidized through some of the CO and HO2 reactions that are predominant downstream. So I'll stop here, and let's see, how are we doing? We got 5. Why don't we take one more break? If you have questions on these sections, and the last part I'll briefly talk about is an anomaly detection method for detecting ignition. Okay. Do you guys want